So I finally got access to create a GPT plugin, which I was really excited about. Essentially, with an existing API, you can get GPT to call different endpoints to gather information. In this case, I'm going to walk you through how I made a plugin for the game of checkers. When I started this project, there was only about 60 plugins. Now there's almost 200. I highly recommend building something on your own as it's still so ridiculously early. Imagine opening up the App Store on the iPhone in 2006 to find less than 200 apps. Before we do anything complicated, let's start by setting up the simple to-do plugin from their Quickstart guide. I'll leave the link in the description. If you've been granted access to plugins as a GPT Plus subscriber, you should be able to click on GPT-4 and select the plugin option. Then you can open up the plugin store to select the plugin you want to enable. In this case, we're developing our own plugin, so we hit the develop your own plugin. We'll get back to this in a second. Continuing to follow the Quickstart guide, we will need to clone the repository. Now in a terminal, we can install the to-do plugin. Then we run pip install-r requirements to install the required packages. And finally run python main, and this will run our plugin on our localhost 5003. So now we can finish completing this setup and putting in localhost 5003, installing the plugin, and now we can ask it like, can you add milk to my to-do list? So now that we're equipped with understanding how a plugin can be run, it's time to create our own. In this case, I'll be creating checkers, and so we get started. Following along OpenAI's documentation, there is really only 3 parts that we need to build. The first is going to be the AI plugin JSON file. This is what tells ChatGPT what your plugin is about. The second is an OpenAPI schema file, which helps ChatGPT call your API endpoints. Not to be confused with OpenAI. OpenAPI is a standard format for describing new APIs. I'll make sure to save the link for this below as well. And lastly, you have to build the API itself. As I'll be implementing checkers, I'll get into that detail later. The exciting part about this setup is that it allows for plugins to be quite ubiquitous. Anybody with an API just needs an AI plugin JSON file on their website, and ChatGPT should be able to integrate with their data. Okay, so here comes the challenging part. How do we actually create an API? Where's the easiest place to host it and deploy all of these things? Thank God for GPT, because all I had to do was ask, and it mentioned Heroku is a good place to host a backend service. I will just briefly skim over their setup, but essentially you can connect your repository, which gets pushed up to the server. You need to set up a proc file, which tells the server how to run your application. And then for me, I asked GPT to write an API for checkers, which it graciously did. I used the Quart framework to host the API, which is a newer version of Flask. Simple, lightweight way of creating an API. I do want to take a moment to talk about ports. One of the most frustrating parts was trying to test that the API was up. GPT-4 told me I could use curl, which as you can see I did, but I kept getting an R10 error on Heroku. The process failed to bind to a port. I've run into this problem before building other applications. I highly recommend understanding the difference between localhost versus quadruple zero. Quart does mention to use quadruple zero instead of localhost, but it's in a very obscure spot. So now that our API is deployed on Heroku, it's time to get back to the other 2 files. We need to still build the OpenAI as well as the manifest file for ChatGPT to work. I was lucky enough to have found this website, PluginLab, that helps you create both of these files. It walks you through the setup and hosting the files pretty well. The first step asks you to describe what your plugin does, which creates your AI plugin.json manifest file. Next, it asks us to provide our OpenAI YAML file. So I pasted in my API that GPT gave me before, and GPT was able to give me a YAML file. Now, it definitely isn't perfect, but it pretty much got me 99% of the way there. You should check that your YAML file was made correctly using the Swagger editor. Next, we just need to configure our backend, which we just set up on Heroku. You can copy on the domain settings. So now with everything set up, we can go to plugin settings, domain, and copy over the domain that we're gonna give over to GPT-4. And last but not least, we can copy this domain into our plugin and paste it in the plugin store. Before showing you the final result, I do want to emphasize the non-linearity of a project like this. So many mistakes were made along the way, but that is a huge part of engineering. I tried implementing with Pygame, which can't be used as a backend service, so that was completely thrown away. I experimented building the front end with Vercel, but the PluginLab was way easier to use. The YAML file was created with bad syntax, the API wasn't being hit properly, the board was basically for ants, the pieces were on the wrong positions, the plugin was loaded improperly, and so much more. My advice for anyone building for the first time is that mistakes are just part of the process. So what's the final result? Well, now you can get a game of checkers going by asking ChatGPT. Because it's a text interface, I just return an image of the board. And again, because of the text interface, you can't actually drag pieces around, which makes the user experience pretty unintuitive. What is interesting though is that my first game against it played terribly. And even though it was not necessarily fine-tuned to play checkers, it seems to be getting better. In the end, this might not be the best example for creating a useful plugin on the GPT plugin store, but I hope you were able to learn something, and if you did, feel free to leave a like or comment below. Oh, and I've submitted to the plugin store, so feel free to play when it comes out.